publicist, Jeff Hill, and introduce the most extraordinary person I know, my dad, who's in the audience. I can't see anybody. Is he here? Dad, will you stand up? Where are you? And I want to thank the LA Film Critics Association and the Egyptian Theater and Josh.
Thank you for being here. But yeah, you picked Sonic Youth. Tell us about it.
So, I sort of formed this idea about safe after my first feature, Poison. I would be in Los Angeles visiting my folks who lived in Lake Encino, and I would take the car and smoke some pot in the car and drive up past their house and sit in front of this house that was further up White Oak, I think, and conjure this narrative, this story of Carol White. And I would play Sonic Youth. And it seems incongruous with what the film looks like, sounds like. But I don't know, I think I was tapping into some transgressive sort of creative zone that was ushering in this very antithetical story about illness. I mean, Safe is sort of the third film of mine made during the AIDS era, right? Starting with Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story, Poison, my first feature film, and then Safe, and all three were about illness.
But you didn't know the people that lived in that house?
No, but the house that I sat in front of ended up being the house we got for the film. So it really completely came full circle.
Did they say, oh, you were that guy getting stoned?
No, I
running
don't think. Or I don't think we would have gotten permission.
Can I ask though specifically, what was it about that house that was an inspiration?
It just had that sort of crazy landscaping, that sort of excessive landscaping with the rocks and the plants and that gate. And I don't know why, it just sort of opened itself up and occupied a certain amount of space that sort of seized my attention.
This idea of these manicured lines, manicured suburbs, and what's happening. This is the first leading performance. Actually, before we get to Julian, let me just ask you about those two movies you just mentioned, Superstar and then Poison. They brought you a lot of notoriety. Does that help or does that hurt in terms of raising money for a project like this?
Well, it certainly, I think it helped in the progress from Superstar to Poison. Where really Superstar was the first film that I'd made that got a certain amount of notoriety and attention, critical attention, but it came out of a sort of experimental, marginal, orientation that I was completely happy to be within. It was sort of like an art project, and it was very much a handmade film. But it opened up the opportunity to apply for arts grants that were the foundation for Poison, and ultimately got us into some trouble with the NEA grant that we got for Poison when the film was finally seen, shown at Sundance, won the grand prize at Sundance. And the fact that it had an NEA grant spurred on the far right and a continued crusade against works of art that were publicly funded. Almost all of these art projects or performance artists' work or exhibitions by Robert Mapplethorpe shared some homoerotic element, and that was clearly motivating their sort of professed resistance to the idea that public funds should be funding artists to begin with, but clearly there was a subtext there. And Poison, for people who remember this time in independent film in America, was a film that was sort of helped usher in what was coined by B. Ruby Rich as the new queer cinema. A lot of filmmakers were responding to what was happening with the AIDS crisis in film. And that first year, 1991, where Poison and Jenny Livingston's Paris is Burning came out, sort of started that moment. Now, then I started to conceive of a very, very different kind of setting for a film about illness. About as far from the war zone as I could imagine in SAFE. And so that became a real challenge in financing. So Christine Vachon, who was my producer on Poison, the first film that she produced, the first feature film that she produced, the first feature film that I directed, set out to get financing for SAFE. We needed $1 million for it. And it took about 2 years to get. And there were times where I would just be like, Christine, it's just not gonna happen. It's so outside what people are expecting from me after nuclear cinema and Poison and all that. And she said, listen, are you committed to this? Do you want to do this? And I would go back and I would reread it, and I would be like, yeah, I want to do it. I really believe in this thing. And she'd be like, okay, we're going to figure it out. And as anyone who knows Christine, she was indefatigable. There was nothing that would stand in her way. And when we did get the financing, but as we ultimately bring Julianne into the conversation, that did help us in that aim.
This is Julianne Moore's first leading role. I mean, we had seen her, I think, in The Fugitive and
Shortcuts.
and As the World Turns.
Yeah.
But right in Shortcuts, obviously.
Yeah.
But this is the one that leads to The Lost World in her whole career. So how did you first connect them?
We realized there was another actress I had in mind for SAFE, who was not a named actor, who I had worked with on projects. She appears in the film, Susan Norman. That's what I knew from college. But we realized we were just hitting walls with trying to get the financing for the movie. And so I was like, okay, I don't think she'd mind me saying so. I offered the script to Jennifer Jason Leigh, and she passed. And she said, I will never forgive myself for passing, which is incredibly flattering. She was so extraordinary. But people were starting to talk about this actress. And I think Shortcuts hadn't come out yet, and we saw a sort of advanced screening of the film. So I saw her in that performance, and I was like, wow, okay, this is someone special. That was a ballsy, risky performance. And so we set up a meeting. And Julianne had read the script. And according to Julie's perspective, she had really connected to it and had an idea of what this character might be like and how she might speak. And so we met in New York, and as always, agents are saying, like, she's not going to audition. You can talk to her, but she's not going to read for you. And she came, but I was like, this character was such a kind of conceptual absence in the concept of the film. And I just was like, I needed to hear it. I needed to see it sort of embodied outside of me. And so she came into the room, it was just she and I and a guy doing the video. And I said, would you consider reading? She said, of course. And in her mind, she was like, I wanna read what I'm hearing in my head to the director. If he doesn't like it, that's fine. But I wanna give him what I have, you know? And this remains one of the most singular experiences, I think, of my career. Because this is such an uncannily difficult character, right? And I think I was so, you know, invested in the conceptual sort of framework of it, where she is this sort of void in the story, and that I wanted to create a story where our identification with the central character was going to be challenged by the fact that this woman has such a fragile sense of who she is. It's so determined by the world around her and the people around her. But I wanted to sort of trigger that sense that we all have at times, that we don't really know ourselves, and that we wonder if who we are is an authentic expression of self. And all of a sudden, she starts to speak, and that voice that was very locked up into the upper regions of her body.
It's also the
the
up talk, right? It's
the upspeak.
The upspeak at every sentence.
Yeah.
When we talked for May December, you told me about how Julianne Moore did a similar thing with her research and found that lisp that helped her get into the character and really unlocked.
Yeah.
There is something that's so passive about Carol in this, and part of it is by the end of the film, she's not speaking like that, right? But at what cost? What I'm curious is, when you started working with Julianne, when did you realize, oh, this is someone I'm going to be working with for the rest of my life?
I think it was a continual, she was, what I felt with her is a completion of my own creative risk-taking that was answered on the other side of the camera by the actor. And so she would be the kind of actor who, if any of the other actors would say, oh, Todd, do you think I could maybe play around with this line a little bit? She would be like, she was possessive of what I'd written, but she knew how to fulfill it on the other side. And what I think was so remarkable that Julianne has continued to be so through our career is how much she understands the medium and the lens, and how much she knows what to hold back, and how ferociously brave she is about that. That she knows that by holding things back, it actually asks the audience to lean in more and fill in the vital gap that exists between viewer and character on the screen. Now, for somebody who had only just begun her career on the big screen, really,
Amazing.
it's an incredible fucking thing.
When I want to talk to you now about a little bit of that camera and sound, because it's so interesting to me how she's buried in the film at first. And she's calling out to her house cleaner, and she's buried in the mix. She's even in the center of the frame, and she's dwarfed by her surroundings. And I've heard you talk about Jean Dielman and movies like Red Desert, but tell us a little bit about your work with camera and sound and Julian, like in that kind of interplay. Was that charted out with the three of you?
It wasn't necessarily charted out with the three of us, but I knew that I wanted this sort of oppressive symmetry, this space between subject and camera, and the fact that she was always sort of a part of the environment, the belongings, the possessions that define the world that she lives in. And in a weird way, she is almost interchangeable with the vases and the ashtrays and the couches and she's desperately trying. You know, Carol White is a character who makes the act of living seem incredibly unnatural. Because it is. You know, and these are the things that we're not, and that most movies are about characters who carry us through the narrative and impose their impact on their environment. This is exactly the reverse. The environment imposes its impact on her.
And you see that in so many different scenes. I like the moment when she falls asleep on her totally toxic couch and wakes up and sees that commercial.
Yeah.
This is often discussed as an AIDS allegory, like you've discussed, which is fair and I think maybe a little reductive. Were you thinking about that in a very conscious way when you were making it or writing it? But when you're shooting it, no.
I was thinking about it all the time. I was thinking about it because AIDS set up this perplexity around an illness for which there was no cure, for which the whole way in which people get infected was a stigmatized relationship.
And blaming the victim, which is what this is.
Blaming the victim. And really, I think what I wanted to engage with in Safe, as opposed to Poison, which was more about the way the media kind of turned the subject of illness into an outsider and threatened the society, and how different genres of movies have dealt with outsiders in different ways and all that. This was really about how we interpret illness, and how illnesses that demand interpretation, that in a way, there's this beautiful quote from a cancer sufferer, a patient named B. Sigmund, who said, "We humans would rather accept culpability over chaos." And I was like, this speaks to such a fundamental human thing, where, you know, you get sick and you're like, oh, I wasn't eating right, or I've really been running myself down, or, you know, I'm the cause of my illness, or a child whose parents are divorcing says, Mom, Dad, it's my fault, right? Because when you're faced with inexplicable, overwhelming circumstances, or an inability to cure or resolve a physical conflict, we feel solace in blaming ourselves for it. And this became a practice within the AIDS era through certain writers who came out of sort of New Age thinking, like Louise Hay, who basically promised to sufferers of HIV this promise that if you love yourself, you won't get sick, you won't get infected, you won't die. And on the one hand, that makes the subject feel empowered. They're like, oh yeah, I got this. It's all on me. I have to learn how to love myself, or I have to do this or that. Ultimately, they're doomed to fail in that. And Larry Gross, the screenwriter and a film critic who wrote about Safe, called it the free market mentality. That's basically like, you're on your own. We don't intervene. We don't look at the conditions under which we live that aren't an even scale for different people, right? And you think it's this pure, unfettered, you know, set of terms, but it actually condemns people to their own, you know, helplessness.
And it's not scientific. I watched this film and I also feel like you're having an enormous amount of fun making it. Like that little sequence you have with the car in the parking garage is like your mini 70s thriller. So, I mean, I am curious if there was just a fun aspect in the sense that you're going to make a slightest pivot to the mainstream or to mainstream style filmmaking.
Clearly.
And then make a thriller, just a weak thriller.
Yeah, that was exactly it. It was the disease movie of the week. It was a huge success. Because those movies do this really interesting thing where they were like, okay, this is going to be about a cancer sufferer or whatever. But the onus would sort of be shifted to, again, a burden on the individual character to come to some kind of realization of who they are in their suffering through the illness, whether they survive it or not, or some identification or identity with the group of other cancer survivors that give them a sense of self. And so what this movie does in the Wrenwood section, which is sort of this like institution of, you know, narrative redemption in a way, it's going to answer, why did I become sick to begin with? And in answering that question, the character is meant to come to some cathartic realization of who they are, right? And so what the movie does, though, is while you're moving toward what you want, which is a narrative resolution for Carol White to find herself at Wrenwood, you also keep learning all of these negative aspects of this place. And
you can't help but include that shot of the house.
Of the house on the hill. And you realize that actually our desire for narrative closure is gonna condemn this woman into repression. And so you're at a loggerhead with what you want as a viewer in a movie that wraps itself up like a disease movie of the week. But you also are like, wait a minute. These closures that we want in movies and in life or whatever are not innocent.
Not innocent, arbitrary. It also strikes me as very much of an LA movie. Like, and from someone who grew up in Encino, like you're saying.
Yeah.
The performances are Vander, and I mean, there's such a great sense of LA types in this as well. Was this intended to be your comment on LA?
I mean, you know, this is a world that I knew in ways. Julianne wore my mom's clothes. We shot in my grandparents' house, my uncle's house. And yet, my mom was nothing like Carol White. My mom had a willfulness, had a passion, had a, you know, she knew who she was. But that culture, and you know, look, it's a lot like a Cirque film, where it's a lot about the language of the American dream, and how he knew how to put these women into houses in his films, and show people, like, the beautiful thing about Cirque is like these, again, it's like the people who aren't up to the tasks that they're confronted with. And the tasks that they're confronted with are things we're all confronted with. They're not heroic. They don't champion their way through their lives and their issues. And you know, they kind of end up almost more burdened by the moral constraints and social constraints that whatever happens, their infidelities or their romances or their inappropriate age differences or whatever it was, makes them confront.
You took on Cirque, obviously, in a very specific way with Far From Heaven as well. Does the period come to you first? Like, I want to make a movie in the 50s.
It comes in tandem, I guess, with, you know, like Fassbinder took Cirque and put it into contemporary German setting, mostly. For him, it was about trying to simplify his storytelling so it would connect to more people in the world, as opposed to what Godard was doing by imposing a sort of Marxist language onto narrative. He was like, no, I'm going to strip that stuff away and get to something really pure in a way and simple about the way we all live our lives and the stories that are like domestic stories that are really all of our lives. You know, they're not just women's stories. They're stories that we all come from houses, we all come from parents, we all come from families.
This movie, as I'm sure many of you know, was selected by a poll, Village Voice, as the best film of the 90s. How significant was a publication like the Village Voice and all journalism in general to your career?
Oh man, I mean, the privileged relationship I've had to film criticism has really been a fundamental part of how my career has survived and persisted. And what was so remarkable is that like Safe came out in '95, critics went to see it, and they were like, what the fuck, I don't get this, I don't know what this is, you know? But the amazing thing that was happening, even within that first year of its release, is critics went back to see the film again and kept talking to each other.
Jen Maslin.
Yes,
Yeah.
she did. And many other people, and I felt like, Jesus Christ, that kind of commitment to film is remarkable and rare. And that has helped propel, you know, my work. So yes, by the time the '90s poll came out, and it was a remarkable and humbling thing to see.
What do you think about the fact that a lot of people returned to Safe during COVID?
Well, I guess no complete surprise. I couldn't watch it again during COVID, man. I needed to take cover. And
What were you watching?
what was I watching during COVID? I was watching. I remember I was watching. I was watching like TV movies from the '70s. Which I still love to watch. But I was working on the Velvet Underground documentary, so I was immersed in the avant-garde of the '60s. And and then we got stuck cutting in Venice, in LA, and I was like, I don't ever want to stop. I was like, this is the luckiest place to be. I get to recombine the films of the 1960s, the avant-garde underground cinema of the '60s, and set it to this music, and set it to this moment of wild invention and risk-taking. And Fonzie, my editor, was cutting next to me, and I was cutting on another Avid, and Adam, our second editor, was in New York cutting, and we were just like swapping our cuts, and it was the best place to be, locked down in.
I have just really two quick questions. I'm getting the signal, but whenever we talk, I always ask you this. Any update on the status of Superstar legally? And no, he's shaking his head.
I haven't revisited it in a concerted way. You know, the UCLA and Sundance collaborated on a restoration of Superstar and of Johnny Gets Spanked, my other short film that followed it. It's just so beautiful, and it's so fun to show it. But I can't really do it publicly. I have to do it under certain conditions, but someday.
And we all heard you had a bit of a tough summer.
Yeah.
What is coming up next for you?
That's not what you're talking about. Yeah, it was tough. Nothing more to say about that one. But no, this project we've been in discussion about is an adaptation of the novel Trust by Hernan Diaz that came out last year. Won the Pulitzer Prize. Kate wins. It landed after a bidding war before it was published. It landed at HBO with Kate Winslet attached. And so she brought it to me. And this, I don't know if some people may have read it, it's an extraordinary sort of layered palimpsest of a story about how history gets written and who gets left out of official histories, namely women. And so it's a limited series at HBO that we hope to be shooting next fall. And it's sort of like a Citizen Kane. It's really special. I'm really excited.
Bella Gomez.
Right?
Yeah, right. Todd is going to be back to introduce Carol, but let's thank him.
Woo!